All right. So my name is Emily Clayton. I'm an analyst in the Transportation Electrification section of Energy Division at the California Public Utility Commission, and I lead our Transportation Electrification Proactive Planning, or TEP, efforts here on our team. So I'd like to start by walking through our agenda and some logistics for today's call. So we'll start off today just providing some background and objectives on where we've been with the TEP work. Then we'll have some introductions of the Guidehouse team who's been leading some of the technical lift associated with this effort. And then we'll have about 30 minutes to dive deep into the inputs and assumptions. I'd like to note that we'll have about 15 minutes of this 30-minute block dedicated to presentation and an additional 15 minutes for folks to ask questions specifically pertaining to the inputs and assumptions. Following this, we'll have some time to walk through the corridor disaggregation methodology, or CDM. And similarly, we'll have about 15 minutes of presentation followed by an opportunity for follow-up questions. Finally, we'll close out today with around 30 minutes for folks to have kind of an open question period. And then we'll end today by walking through just some of the next steps with our proceeding related to this work. Next slide, please. So in terms of participation for those question periods today, we'd ask that if you could please share your name and organization before you provide comments. That will assist us with note taking today. So we'll keep questions addressed to those question and answer periods, and everyone should be muted by default. However, we have either the opportunity to pose questions in the chat, or questions can be provided verbally using the raise hand function, and then we can unmute you. And you can see that on the lower right-hand side of the screen. All right, next slide, please. So I'll briefly provide some background and objectives on where we've been with this TEP effort. So our public-facing efforts in this work began back in 2023. In May, we released a draft staff proposal on freight infrastructure planning, which is aimed to establish a framework to develop investment-grade inputs and assumptions and medium and heavy-duty charging scenarios to be used in long-term grid planning to identify medium and heavy-duty ZEV freight infrastructure needs. Building on these early efforts, in April 2024, the scoping memo for R23-12008 includes a track for TE proactive planning, with the goal of addressing the need for zero-emission vehicle planning related to corridor freight charging infrastructure, as well as similar loads such as light-duty charging along corridors. The rationale for this focus area highlighted the significant load growth anticipated from this type of charging and its likely localized infrastructure impacts, especially for the distribution system. When we think of proactive planning in this context, we're considering how to plan beyond the horizon of customer applications, given the long lead time needed to develop electrical infrastructure that can serve these charging needs, while at the same time ensuring that we're planning for TE in a way that balances ratepayer affordability concerns. And so over the last year, through extensive internal and interagency collaboration, most notably with our partners at the California Energy Commission's Energy Assessments Division, I'd like to especially thank Andre Friedman and Quentin Gee for their support with this effort. We've been working to develop inputs and assumptions, as well as corridor disaggregation methodology, which we see as providing a framework for informing planning processes for that long-term timeframe, with information about the location, size, and timing of TE loads. While we have modeled outputs from this methodology with inputs from the 2023 IPER, at this time, I'd like to emphasize upfront that we view TEP as a replicable methodology that leverages transparent inputs and assumptions rather than a one-time study. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. So our object, sorry, back to the other slide. So our objectives for today's webinar are primarily to familiarize stakeholders here on the call today with the characteristics of those TEP inputs and assumptions, as well as the corridor disaggregation methodology. And secondly, we'd like to provide an opportunity for stakeholders to pose any clarifying questions they may have about those inputs and assumptions, the CDM, or any of the ruling questions prior to the due date for opening comments on the ruling. All right. So at this time, I'd like to hand things back over to the Guidehouse team, who will be leading our next section. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Appreciate that. And good morning, everyone. My name is Derek Jones. I'm a director with Guidehouse here in San Francisco, where we've been supporting California's TE ecosystem since 2015. And we currently have the privilege of supporting the CPUC on TEP and other TE-related proceedings. So you'll see our team here today, who I'm joined by Karen Mose, who is our overall project manager, Tina Arteme, who's our task lead for TEP. She marshals all of our efforts. We also have Vivek Nath, our senior technical advisor, and our two key presenters who you see here, Will Shurjula. He's going to take us all through the inputs and assumptions work that we're providing for feedback, as well as Gavin Aiello, who's worked on our corridor designation methodology as our lead. And we're very excited to share our work in supporting the CPUC with you all here today in helping to understand the long-term corridor grid impacts from these freight vehicles in the spirit of informing planning in the years to come. So keeping that short and sweet, I'm now going to hand off to Will, and Mr. Shirjula can take us away into the inputs and assumptions. Please take it away, Will.
Thanks, Derek. Pleasure to be here. And so wanted to give an overview of the inputs and assumptions and provide some context as it's used in TEP and for the CDM. And so I think an important perspective is that this particular analysis that comes from a range of assumptions. It is aligned with HYPER where it's feasible and the information is out there and it's supposed to be publicly vetted, and it can be used for a variety of different evaluations, analyses, projects, such as the corridor designation methodology. And the key here is that we're trying to ground this analysis and future analyses in empirical data where possible, and then also be transparent for where this information is coming from, and then get feedback about this information. It also can be updated as additional information becomes available in this emerging market. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next slide. So the TEP modeling INA, it is a bottom-up analysis. So we are looking at a very granular level where vehicles are located, where they're domiciled, especially for medium and heavy duty vehicles, how much energy they're using, where they're driving, when they recharge, and also kind of where they recharge. So I think what that allows you to do is it allows you to get an idea of how much energy they will need and where that will be coming from. And then that allows you to have better insight into planning, thinking about transmission, distribution, generation, a whole range of applications for this particular INA. And for this particular presentation, we're going to be talking about the corridor designation tool, which is thinking about this really challenging situation of medium and heavy duty vehicles. Where are they driving? How much charging they're going to be needing from kind of public stations and things like that? And where do we anticipate they might be needing that charging support to facilitate their electric vehicle routes and achieve to achieve California's transportation electrification goals. And let's go to the next slide. So as mentioned earlier, this particular INA, it was developed to be used across a range of projects. And so the CDM here is mostly looking at the corridor designation, but there are also facets of this INA that can be used to think about charging infrastructure, the number of ports, the type of power that they use, thinking about charging at depots versus public charging, and then extending the range out and thinking about this really challenging situation of when are fleets and depots, are they able to charge kind of within their depot, or when are they kind of required to charge publicly? So you can think about an individually owned medium or heavy duty vehicle where they might not have the charging capabilities within their home, and so they might be using more public charging. And so I think that this particular INA tries to provide insight into a range of different electric vehicle uses. Next slide, please. And so talking about the inputs, some of the information that we've used include vehicle registration data, especially for light duty vehicles, for individually owned vehicles, and then domicile data for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And so I think that that is trying to get at a key issue that has been discussed in the literature, where vehicles are registered may not be where they're domiciled. And where they're domiciled is really important, because that is where they're charging overnight, and then also is the nexus for their routes that are going out as we're thinking about public charging for those particular types of vehicles. And so that domicile information is very challenging to get. And so we've been using Geotab as a third-party data vendor to provide insight into where medium and heavy duty vehicles are domiciled. In addition, we also pull in information from various studies from national laboratories and government agencies. And then we also have academic studies to inform some of our assumptions and inputs. Finally, we have some geospatial layers, which allow you to look at the impacts in different ways. Next slide. So one of the key inputs is the number of vehicles. And so that number of vehicles is closely aligned with IPERT. And so that is the vehicle forecast, which looks at the number of vehicles that we expect to be on California's roads. And then it's also divided into different vehicle classes. So that could be a, class 4 delivery truck, or it could be a semi-truck, or it could be a vocational truck. There's a whole series of hyper classes that this particular INA is aligned with. And then also, one of the things that we do is we take those hyper vehicle counts, and then we use the information from registrations and domicile to disaggregate that down to the census tract level, which is kind of one of the core inputs for where we expect charging to take place. Let's go to the next slide. And then another of the inputs is charging infrastructure. So based off of pilot studies that we've seen, based off of interviews that we have conducted, for example, one thing that we found is that, the difference between a level 2, which is a little bit more powerful than your standard home charge, like plug in your home, and then DC fast charging, that's a pretty big difference in terms of the installation at depots or public charging, and then also has ramifications for charging time for a vehicle. A lower powered charger will take longer to charge a battery. And so thinking about what type of charging power different vehicles would use under different circumstances, at a depot, you usually have a longer dwell time. So they would be parked overnight and they have more hours than if you're at a public station and you need to get back on a route in 30 minutes. So thinking about the charger power and the location of that charging use helps us to give information about what type of charger we expect to be used for different types of charging applications. Additional inputs include the number of vehicles that we expect to be using a charger. So multiple vehicles would be using public chargers, for example. Whereas at a depot, it might be more of a one port to one vehicle ratio. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's also the charger power, where you have, from level 2, which is 7 kilowatts, up to megawatt charging, which would be used for semis and some of the much bigger vehicles. Sources for this, as mentioned earlier, you've got a bunch of public entities, you've got research out there, and then trying to pull in pilot projects. Run on Less is a pretty big one that's going on in California right now, and try to pull that information such that we have empirical data which can inform our inputs and analysis. And it's not all kind of conceptual modeling data. We're seeing what fleet managers are doing on the ground right now, which is important as you are trying to understand a nascent market. Next slide, please. So you have the vehicles, and then you've got the charging infrastructure necessary to support those vehicles, and then you also have the impact. So how much how much energy do these vehicles need, and when would they charge during the day? And so there's a fairly simple calculation. You've got the vehicle, the number of miles it drives, and the fuel efficiency, which tells you the energy that you would need to provide that vehicle's power. But then you also have, where are those vehicles charging? Are they charging at depots? Are they charging at public stations? Figuring that allocation of public versus private charging is important. And that's influenced by a lot of things, including driving range, route information, and then we have kind of the load shapes for what hour of the day are these vehicles charging. So, a lot of vehicles, they plug in at night, and then they would recharge in those late night and early morning hours, because that's when they're not driving. That's when power is cheapest. It's a good use. But then sometimes vehicles will go out and then they return to the depot, or they might need to recharge to either at the depot or a public station in order to complete the routes that they have throughout the day. And so trying to understand when vehicles are charging across an entire class of vehicles and where they are recharging helps us understand the amount of power that utilities will need to provide on an hourly basis for these vehicles. And we have a whole host of inputs for these. This is coming from a lot of trip data from various public entities. We are pulling in research, and we're trying to understand load shapes, to the extent that we have vehicles that are charging. We have charging telemetry data. We can see what that looks like. We have to balance that with, are we looking at telemetry data for 10 vehicles? Are we looking at it for 100 vehicles? It gives us an idea for how reliable some of this information is. So within the INA, in addition to the values, there's also fields like, how valid is this? How reliable is this information? Do we feel comfortable with this input and assumption? And so for some classes like light duty fleet vehicles, we feel much more comfortable. There are a lot more of those on the road. We understand them better. For long haul semi trucks, not so much. It is more conceptual, more hypothetical, but we still have to estimate how we expect those vehicles to be driven and when we expect them to charge and how much power they'll need. So I think that in addition to the values themselves in the INA, we also try to provide our confidence in those inputs. And so that's an important part of the INA that we've been producing. Next slide, please. And then in addition to all of these, there's also a geospatial layer, and they're used to identify location-based impacts. They can be used to disaggregate impacts for specific utilities. Yep. And so on to the next slide. So that is a high-level information about the inputs and assumptions, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Just a reminder that you can use the raise hand function or type your question in the chat.
looks like Jason Berry. That's I think,
Okay, Jason, you should be able to unmute to ask your question.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
yes.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity here. Thanks, Will. A couple of questions, just to clarify some of the terms you're using, just to understand on the assumptions. One is you talk about public charging loads. How do you define public versus private? And I asked in the context of my company, Terawatt Infrastructure. You know, we build private charging depots, and so they are, in a term, publicly accessible as long as a customer contracts with us. They can come in and come out and schedule times, but it's not a public charging depot per se in the classic sense, and it's not a behind the fence like at a customer's yard. So how do you define those?
Right. Really good question. And I think it is pointing to that this information that we are receiving over and over, where there are a lot of different business models that people are trying. I think the simple answer is for Terawatt, it would be public because you have this kind of shared charging. It's not a behind the fence for an individual company. But
Well, they
more
can
broadly,
they can be an individual company.
could be an individual company, but it's not
Yes.
necessarily so kind of on their premises at their headquarters, we would
Yes.
consider that depot charging, and then kind of public charging would be outside of that. So maybe they are looking to share that with another company. I think as these business models are emerging, we're trying to understand what they are and the best way to think about them.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, there are various companies that are providing that sort of, it's not quite public, but it is more public than, you know, a private company's owned charging infrastructure on their property.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah.
And I think trying to get at that is challenging, and it's also a very fluid environment.
Absolutely. It kind of leads me to my next question. You did have light duty in there along with medium and heavy duty, and they're all very different use cases. But are you anticipating the large growth and surge in the light duty fleet sector, specifically around the rideshare AV industry? Those are going to, you're going to see a lot of that in the coming years. And so just wondering how you're anticipating and looking at that, if at all.
Yeah, I think AV and rideshare, the last, I would say, year, it felt like there's been an inflection point. And so I would say that that is still something that we're trying to wrap our head around and understand and incorporate. It's not as, I think that I would give that a little bit more time to marinate. It seems like it's going to be big and important, but there's a question of like, how much does it replace other vehicles, and how much is it being used, and how extensive is it?
Great. Happy to talk offline, give you thoughts, and point you in different directions for data sources on that. But I do see that being a very large infill in the next 3 to 5 years. While, you know, heavy duty is, you know, the ramp curve is, you know, not there today, but you're gonna have that impacting systems, and it's gonna be in very different places than probably where you're thinking as well.
Yeah, and I think one other thing relevant to this particular conversation is we're really focused on corridor charging, and it's a you know, a slightly adjacent to, you know, the ride sharing AV, which will probably mostly be within a city. And so I think it's important, but a little bit adjacent, but definitely something the INA is looking to include.
Great, good to know. Thank you.
Next up, Sam from UCS.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm Sam Houston here from Union of Concerned Scientists. I have a couple questions as well. The first one is about the use of vehicle telematics. I totally agree with you that understanding the domicile locations are super important and useful, and you know, kind of essential for this exercise. I'm wondering if you can, I saw a note under the limitations that it's going to be, you only have maybe 5% of the population covered, and then you're going to be kind of scaling that. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you're going to scale it and how you're going to apply it, so I could understand, that limitation a little bit better.
Yeah, and so it's a little bit different based off of vehicle class. We have a little bit more information for Class 8 vehicles, which is great. We have a little bit less information for the large number of, medium duty delivery trucks, for example. And so what we can do is we have information about where these vehicles are registered. And then we have information where some of these vehicles are domiciled. And so we can use that domicile location to kind of shift around the vehicle counts within census tracts. It is, definitely there are drawbacks to both, as everyone's very aware, but we try to use that domicile location information of a portion of the population to readjust and reallocate those vehicles. We don't use one or the other completely, but we try to incorporate both of them to make it a little bit better. But at the same time, I'm sure we're missing some vehicles. We're going to be missing some vehicles either way you look at it. And we hope that by kind of combining the two, we can get a little bit better answer, a little more accuracy.
Yeah, that's really helpful just to confirm that you're kind of cross-tabbing and using these things in conjunction. So thanks for that. The other question I wanted to offer at this time is about the vehicle efficiency. I was talking with some colleagues about this content. So thanks for giving us some fun fodder for discussion. And one thing that came up is how the vehicle efficiencies can, kind of vary greatly based on climate and terrain, and how you may have captured that or, done, you can't have an infinite number of numbers and variables here, but how are you thinking about the fact that the efficiency can vary wildly if, the truck route's going uphill one way, and that's going to, particularly since that really can drive, some of these peak loads for certain routes, they may be quite a bit higher if they're going uphill, or if, they're having to go in the cold versus not.
So I'm going to punt here a little bit because the vehicle efficiency is one area that we align with Piper. And so I know that they have different vehicle efficiency values for different areas. And so I don't want to speak too much because I'm not as familiar with their methodology. Thankfully, California doesn't have the wild swings in temperature that you see in places like my home, Wisconsin. But you do have those mountains, and you do have hills, which could affect the vehicle efficiency. I think that's an area that deserves additional research and trying to figure out, how can you have a more accurate answer without blowing up the complexity of the model, and how can you get close enough to make meaningful inputs and assumptions while still recognizing that the number that you're using is not completely accurate. So I think that's an area that's important, and I think that's an area that we're looking into exploring. At the same time, we are aligned in the INA with Hyper there.
Okay, that's really helpful. I missed the alignment with Hyper. So just for example, when I'm looking at table 4-1 on page 28, which is fuel efficiency by vehicle use case, there's a single value there for 2024 versus 2045 efficiency.
Yeah.
But that is not everything under the hood of this. It's actually varied by, okay, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next up, we have a question from Dean Taylor.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dean Taylor, consultant for Natural Resources Defense Council. Can you go back, I guess, one slide on locations?
Tina, could we? Oh,
Yeah, you had. Can you go more in detail on locations. I think that's a pretty big deal. I know in the pending loads and scenario planning, there's an awful lot of talk about hotspots, and where earlier you talked about focusing on corridors, yet most of the hotspots are not really corridors. They're like warehouse and factory districts and seaports, where you find an awful lot of trucks congregating, especially for the, I'm mainly speaking about medium and heavy duty.
Dean, I'd like to table this question until after we've talked through the CDM, and I think that may clarify the scope a little bit, and then we can, if it feels unanswered, we can come back to it in the general question period. Next, I'd like to take a question from Saeed.
Thank you for the presentation. Really appreciate that. My question is on the assumption of the waiting time for the charge. Sometimes the application involves, let's say a driver wants to take a lunch, they need only 30 minutes for charging, but they get like 60 minutes. This waiting time, available time to charge, which is going to create some VGI capability, is not modeled in the inputs that you consider for the CDM. And I think that's going to make a huge difference here. Do you have any plan to consider that input in the model?
So VGI in general is also one of those, like AV, it's an emerging area, especially for medium and heavy duty vehicles. I think there's a lot of scope there. There's a lot of potential there. It's not something that was in the scope for this particular IMA, but I think that's a really good suggestion.
Not just VGI, how about, let's say, if you set the stage for VGI, one of the main things to consider in the input model is just considering how much time they would be able to provide for charging. Have you done anything in that? Which corridor would be able to provide a certain amount of wait time for the charging? Have you done that analysis?
Yeah, so I might kick this over to Gavin because he understands the route information, but within the route information, there is data about how long they are staying at particular sites. So we could get some information about the potential to use VGI. That being said, that's not something that we're looking at for this particular analysis, but I think it is an area for expansion.
I see. And a follow-up question on that is regarding the assumption for the type of load is that you are considering a static load. I had a comment that your colleague Vivek answered partially. So my question is, are you considering the change in the technology? For example, we are planning for the next 20 years. So have you considered the potential improvements in the vehicle technologies that could impact the load in the future in this model?
So the load shapes themselves, they're not static throughout. They are dynamic throughout the day, hour to hour. That being said, I think some year-over-year change to load shapes is possible. It's not something that we have used, but I think we'd have to look at the reasons why those load shapes would change over time. And I think I just worry about kind of false precision there, where it starts to get very conceptual. And I think that the farther away that gets, the more unclear it becomes. And so I like the idea of having, like, we have load shapes that's how vehicles are actually charging, but then assumptions about how they would charge with VGI in the future, there's just a lot of hypothetical issues there. And I think it's an interesting exercise, but it's a little more hypothetical than we're looking for this particular IMA.
Next,
Thank
sorry.
you.
Next, I'd like to take a question from David Castle.
Hi, this is Dave Castle with Southern California Edison. I had a question about alignment with IPER. You mentioned that the vehicle counts were coming out of IPER and that the efficiencies were coming out of IPER. Can you talk a little about the other assumptions, particularly just leading up to the total energy usage, and whether that's similar to what's used in IPER to get the total energy usage for TE, or if it's different? Is it more, is it less? Do you have any general thoughts about that?
Yeah, VMT efficiency vehicle counts at the state level. So vehicle counts at the state level match, and then kind of the disaggregation portion is where some of the where we incorporate different inputs. Fuel efficiency, you've got those different values that for fuel efficiency and VMT that are coming from IPER, and so we align with them there. And then the way that that is applied, kind of at a more geographically granular area, I think that that is that is also something that we can discuss a little bit more, and I think that that is an area that we are aligning with IPER.
So just to clarify, so you would expect the total energy across the vehicle classes is going to be aligned with the total energy that IPER forecasts for TE. Is that what I heard? Or?
Yeah. So those main inputs, maybe not the demand, depending on if I think we have slightly different load shapes in some instances, but the energy should be the same.
Thanks.
Or just really close. Might be some slight differences.
All right, so I believe we're out of questions with the hand raised queue, but we have about 10 more minutes, so we're going to circle back to some questions that are unanswered in the chat. Meredith from Gridwell asked, she's interested in confirming that CEC's Heavy Pro or the data in Heavy Pro wasn't an input, or was that integrated in another step of the process? I'd like to pose that to the Guidehouse team.
Heavy Pro or heavy load?
I believe heavy load, if we're referring to the CEC methodology.
Yeah. So we worked with, I've been talking with Ben and the folks at LBNL. I think we're looking to align regarding the load shapes. I think we're having some discussions there. I would say that the models are fundamentally different. So in INA, we have inputs for vehicle charger and the vehicles per port, whereas those are outputs from heavy load. So two different models, both coming at it from different directions, but they are both interesting ways of looking at a very tricky problem.
Next, I'm seeing a question from Benjamin Hoffman. The INA report identifies battery state of charge as a proxy for whether an EV will use public or private charging. Can you elaborate on how this will be used? Will you be modeling each vehicle's state of charge, or is this simply used to estimate the ratio of load that will appear on public versus private chargers?
Yeah, so the idea here is that we, based off of a literature review, the expectation is that some vehicles will recharge before they get to a certain state of charge. So they wouldn't want to get their vehicle to get below 20% or 10%, or kind of the state of charge has some relevance for whether a vehicle is going to use public charging or not. And so we're trying to incorporate this notion of how far is a vehicle driving? Is it driving 10 miles, 20 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles? How does that relate to the expected state of charge on that particular trip? And how does that relate to the probability that a vehicle would seek out public charging based off that state of charge? So try not to get into the weeds too much, but I think it is one of the factors based off of our literature review, which is informing whether a vehicle how likely a vehicle would be to use public charging along corridors.
I'd like to provide Anderson Bowles with the opportunity to ask his question live. Just one moment, I'll unmute you. Maybe we can come back to.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thanks. Yeah, my question was really about the time that charges are expected to occur. So, are you considering any unique customer types or operational cycles in how you're estimating the time of day that a charge is expected to occur?
So in a way, yes, but not quite to the granularity you're talking about. We have average load shapes. So it says across all customers of a particular type of vehicle. We expect that semi trucks are going to charge at different times than individually owned vehicles. And so the charging time that we're looking at is supposed to be an average time across all vehicles of a particular class.
Okay. So the granularity of that data that you're using for those averages, is that coming from like state level data, or is it specific to certain service territories, or how are you breaking it out for the unique regions and unique vehicle classes operating within those regions?
So I think that right now there is a single load shape by class for the state of California. And that I think right now what we're trying to do is to get as many of these load shapes as we can and say, like, is there a difference between medium duty vehicles in SDG&E's territory versus PG&E's territory? If we find that there is a meaningful difference, I think that that is reason for us to adjust those load shapes. And right now it is very challenging to get like telemetry data and actual charging data across different IOU territories. If that is information that you all have, that would be awesome, and we would love to include it. And so right now, one of the things we're doing is we are reaching out to IOUs to get that information.
All right, we have time for one last question. I'd like to give Thomas from PG&E the opportunity to ask this question.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for the overview here. I had a question regarding the fleet survey and the fleet interviews that you all had done. It looked like it was a fairly limited sample size of 9, and I just was curious, and I think those were conducted, over the past couple of years, and of course, a lot has changed since that time. So I'm just curious if you have plans to conduct more of these interviews, conduct like updated interviews with the folks you've already contacted with, and sort of how you're thinking about sort of the diversity of respondents that you're getting from that, and sort of broadly speaking, what is the plan, if there is one, for future fleet interviews?
Yeah, so we have conducted a series of interviews with both fleet managers as well as site operators. And so we're trying to incorporate that information. It was not incorporated in this INA because that's part of a more recent work stream with CPUC, but that's the sort of information that we're trying to get a fuller perspective on. When are these vehicles charging? What are the important factors for when and where they're charging? And definitely something that we want more, because that is the information that's really important, especially in an emerging market. Kind of those interviews can give you more information than kind of telemetry data, which is very challenging to come by.
All right, thanks everyone for the questions. I think these have been really helpful to hear everyone's perspectives on this. I think at this time we'll move on to our next segment on the corridor designation methodology. And again, we'll have a time for general questions at the end. If we have any unanswered questions for this section, we can circle back on that.
Thank you, Emily. I'm Gavin Aiello. I'll be taking on the overview of the corridor designation methodology. We'll start with a couple slides that kind of discuss at a high level purpose, what it is exactly, how it's used, and then we'll dig in a little more to see a little bit under the hood of this methodology. So starting with purpose, the corridor designation methodology was developed in order to address the public charging demand, public DC charging demand associated with light, medium, and heavy-duty electric vehicles along California's major highway corridors. as well as depot charging for medium and heavy duty vehicles close to those corridors, within 1 mile of those corridors. And by addressing this, it is intended to inform targeted grid planning so that targeted grid planning can incorporate this specific load, this public DC charging and depot charging in their efforts. Additionally, as the CDM provides a disaggregation of IPER load, this can inform existing planning processes. So those are the key purposes of this specific methodology: targeted grid planning for that incorporates that segment of EV load, public DC charging, depot charging close to those corridors, as well as planning process. So next is the what exactly is the corridor designation methodology on the next slide. So what exactly is this methodology? Well, it is a bottoms-up granular disaggregation of IPER-aligned state-level EV charging loads, specifically public DC charging and medium and heavy-duty depot charging. And it is done at the corridor segment level. And I'll talk about what that means at the corridor segment level on the next slide. It aligns with IPER as mentioned, and it essentially uses telematics data to do that disaggregation down to the corridor segment. So we're looking at origin and destination data to determine where vehicles are traveling from which location to another location, as well as route analysis data, which tells us exactly what corridors they are traveling on. And so this gives us perspective, as I said, like where they're traveling, as well as how much energy they're using as their vehicles are using as they're going from their origin to their destination. This methodology is intended to have it's very forward looking. It looks out to 2045. It gives a perspective out to 2045. And what that allows the methodology to do is provide proactive distribution planning for planners. It does this through a methodology that isn't prescriptive as to where chargers may be located. We're not looking to say that a charger will be, or purport that we know where a charger will be in 2040 or 2045, the exact corridor segment. So we look at things like the likelihood of charging to give a perspective of, along all those corridors, where is a vehicle likely to charge, assuming that a vehicle could theoretically charge at any one of those corridors. So next, we're going to go into, in the next slide, we'll discuss how exactly is the corridor designation methodology will be used. So as mentioned, it's a disaggregation methodology that'll take IPER-aligned state load for public DC charging and depot charging and disaggregate it down to very granular levels at what are called corridor segments. Now, corridor segments are essentially pieces of the various corridors, the major highway corridors throughout California. And so those highway corridors are, they're major arterial and collector roads, interstate highways, collector distribution lanes, or controlled access highways, all derived from what's called the FAF5, or Freight Analytics Framework 5 data set. So it's a national highway data set that provides perspective on the corridors across the entire country, but obviously we're focusing on California. So we get this collection of roads, these major roads that are very long, and we identify any sort of variation between adjacent pieces of road in terms of traffic. So if you have like a very long road, I-5, and you have two specific pieces of it, and this piece has more traffic than this other piece, they're adjacent, they're touching each other, that's the first step in terms of creating the corridor segments. They're two separate pieces of that broader corridor I-5. From there, we further slice them to make sure that they are uniquely within an IOU or POU service territory, within a utility service territory. Our intention there is to be able to be precise, essentially, about where these corridor segments live and which IOU or POU or utility will be, capturing that specific segment. So we make sure that those corridor segments are uniquely within a utility service territory. We also make sure that they're only 3 miles in length at most. So, it can be less than 3, but no longer than 3. So in summation, a corridor segment is basically a unique fraction of a broader corridor that comes from this list: arterials, collector roads, interstate highways, collector distribution lanes, very small pieces that at most are 3 miles long and uniquely found within a utility service territory. So we're taking IPER load, state level, bringing it down to that very granular level, looking at other very granular pieces that Will was talking about earlier, such as, vehicle classes, charging use cases, and getting load down there. And this will provide that perspective that I mentioned when we talked about the purpose of this, to provide for that grid planning. That very granular perspective will allow for that grid planning. Next slide. So now, having gone through the purpose and what it is at a very high level and how it can be used, reducing these state level loads down to very granular pieces, we wanted to give a perspective of a little bit under the hood of this methodology and show you the building blocks that go into the corridor designation methodology. And I want to hit back on something that Emily mentioned early on, that this is a methodology, it's not a study. These building blocks can be iterated on. Currently, we have been using IPER 2023 data. We're looking to make sure that that's updated for IPER 2024. Just one piece of a broader whole that can, again, be iterated on and updated over time, because it is a methodology. It is not a study. It is meant to be kind of existing and evolving as these inputs and assumptions evolve as well. So making sure it's capturing the latest and greatest information and making it a more robust methodology to do this disaggregation. The two key pieces that I want to focus on this slide, I know there's a handful of boxes, but the two key pieces are the estimators, and those are those hard teal boxes, the CDM corridor EV trips estimator and the corridor energy estimator. And what you can essentially think of with these two pieces and broadly about this methodology is that it establishes how much EV traffic is happening, like how many trips are being taken by EVs and along what corridors where they're actually occurring. And then from there, we need to understand what is the actual energy associated with those EV trips, specifically the energy that will be charging at public DC infrastructure, as well as understanding the depot load, which is a little separate from this specific piece, because this is focusing on that traffic data as well as the energy associated with that public load. So starting with the EV trip estimator, that's where that traffic data, the telematics data, origin destination, road analysis comes into play, along with the corridor segment. So we're then establishing where vehicles are traveling, where they're starting, where they're going, what roads they're taking, how those relate to the actual corridor segments. And then we layer in vehicle adoption to get a perspective on, of those total trips, how many of them are electric? Because obviously we're getting a large number of trips from this origin destination data. Not all of them are going to be electrified. They will evolve over time, becoming more and more electric as more and more electric vehicles are adopted. And so we use that vehicle adoption forecast to kind of inform that level of electrification of the trips traveling throughout California's highway corridors. Taking those trips, and you see the BEV trips by CDM corridor segment, taking that piece and then introducing a number of inputs that are associated with essentially the energy needed and the charging that will happen for those vehicles. We're able to come up with the energy estimates and a methodology of disaggregating energy down to those corridor segments. And so what do we use to kind of understand that energy? We're using things like vehicle domicile location and BEV driving range to help inform states of charge assumptions. We're using load shapes and that split between public and private charging, so that we're focusing on that piece that we're interested in, that public DC charging. And then very importantly, we want to call out the probability of charge given a state of charge. This is something that's very important to understand. Again, going into the ability to forecast long-term and not be prescriptive about where charging is, where chargers may exist, where a charger may be located, what specific segment. We integrate this likelihood of charging essentially to say at any given corridor segment, assuming that charging infrastructure could be at that segment in 10, 15 years time, what is the likelihood that a vehicle would charge there given its state of charge, and other information associated with it, where its domicile may be, where it's coming from, its origin and destination, what's its starting state of charge, etc. So we integrate that in there, as well as state of charge assumptions to get where that charging is happening, layer on load profiles in order to determine at what point in the day that amount of energy that is happening at that corridor segment is actually being received, so we can get a sense of peak energy for a corridor segment. And that ultimately comes through on that far right with that last box, the kilowatt hours and the kilowatts estimated for a corridor segment. And again, this is all done at a very granular level, not just at the corridor segment, but looking at those vehicle use cases, charging use cases. So this isn't like every single vehicle has one flavor. It's the various types of vehicles each have their own unique flavors that all have assumptions that are built from INA, informed by IPER, flowing into them to try and be as robust as possible in terms of capturing the nuances and granularities of the charging use cases that go into the public charging ecosystem. I think we can go to the next piece. So what we wanted to touch on here is just give a perspective, an example of outputs from the CDM. And what we're looking at, as mentioned, this is public charging. So this is focusing, these outputs would only focus on the public DC charging. And then it's associated with IPER 2023. Again, methodology meant to be iterated on and updated, looking to update that with IPER 2024. And as time goes on, any sort of updates and better inputs that can be implemented. But so that's essentially what we're looking at here. And what we are seeing is basically hotspots spread out throughout California's throughout California's corridors. And again, touching on that likelihood of charging piece that isn't prescriptive about where charges are. We're seeing it as a much more continuous mapping that highlights hotspots as opposed to discrete points where a charger might exist and thus capturing all sorts of energy there. It's a much more fluid, continuous mapping because of that approach to likelihood, which again facilitates the ability to look at long-term perspectives and do proactive planning for expected load or for load that could come on. One of the consequences of this, of the modeling, and as I mentioned, we're not just looking at the vehicle counts, where they're coming from, where they're going, how they're getting there, but the state of charge assumptions, is that a lot of the results are not concentrated where there's heavy traffic necessarily. If it was concentrated where there's heavy traffic, you would only see hotspots like, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento. Instead, what we're seeing are some hotspots in those cities, but additionally, a lot of hotspots in intermediate areas along corridors that connect things. So what we're seeing is, particularly on the right, which is 2045 perspective, hotspots connecting Los Angeles, San Diego with Nevada and Arizona. Hotspots connecting San Diego and Los Angeles to San Francisco and Sacramento. So that intermediate areas where people who are driving, they start their trip, have a certain state of charge, that charge depletes as they get like maybe halfway to their location. That's when they start thinking about charging. We're starting to see that reflected because this methodology does incorporate states of charge and assumptions around likelihoods of charging based on states of charge, not just what is traffic, like how much traffic, how much volume. I think we can go to the next slide, which is the key takeaways. So as a quick wrap up of what I've just discussed, hopefully it was being fairly brief with this. Overall, the CDM, the corridor designation methodology, is a disaggregation methodology that leverages the inputs and assumptions that Will was just describing, and those align quite well with IPER. The CDM is a granular disaggregation methodology, bottoms up, granular disaggregation methodology. It does this at a very granular level, those corridor segments, which at the most are 3 miles long and are uniquely positioned within utility service territories to give that perspective of, that load would be associated with that utility service territory, or that segment can be associated with that utility service territory, but also granular at the vehicle duty class, charging use case, and technology level. So getting that nuance within those vehicles and how those vehicles travel, how a medium and heavy duty vehicle, how a long haul truck might be different from a passenger car, capturing all of those nuances. Finally, it's a long-term perspective that drives this methodology, and that requires us to be non-prescriptive about where the charging will happen. So we take an approach that looks at likelihood of charging and is continuous and almost can be considered assuming that charging can happen at any corridor segment as we look towards the future, as we look into the long run. So that is overall, that's what this corridor designation methodology is. And I think at this point, we'll turn it over for questions.
We can take a question from Alex from CalSTART to start.
Hi, yeah, had two questions. One, I was wondering if the CPUC could clarify how you're intending to use this model, and especially how you see it fitting in given the high DER filings that the utilities just made with pending loads and scenario planning and whatnot. And also, I think somebody asked about this earlier, but yeah, just a little bit more clarity on how you see it. I guess it looks a little bit like it could be privileging some of the load growth on corridors as opposed to in hotspots that may not be a mile from a corridor, and just kind of how you see those hotspots fitting in.
I think the first question, I'm happy to answer the second question about, looking at areas outside of these corridors. So in terms of, first of all, I think this methodology, again, because it is a methodology and can be iterated on, we are always looking to expand that network of roads. We start with key corridor segments. I think there's about 150 of them in there. But the intention is looking at that, growing that, understanding what other roads to be incorporated into here in order to capture exactly what you're talking about. This isn't the only place where charging is happening. The other consideration here is what exactly we're focusing on in terms of the load. We're looking at essentially public DC charging that's supposed to facilitate that kind of connecting those corridors. So, charging that's taking place off of those corridors, it might be a different use case than what we think of like those DC chargers that are essentially connecting cities. We kind of think of it through the lens of like maybe NEVI is something that you can kind of think closer aligned with this. So it's not going to necessarily capture like an L2 that's in like a downtown area. That's just basically intended to facilitate like local charging. It's looking at that DC network for corridor charging. But again, expanding that corridor network to start capturing a broader network of roads is an important consideration and something that we're interested in. I also want to flag that the broader analysis does capture like the origin destination data. The broader methodology has the ability to capture some other roads. So there's likely some of that traffic that is taking place on smaller roads that does show up on the corridors being captured in those corridors. So we do, by virtue of what we have in terms of origin destination data, some perspective into that sort of cars that aren't just on major corridors. They're coming from everywhere. It's just that they happen to be identified as likely to charge on those corridors. I think your first question that was targeted towards the CPUC.
Yeah, I can follow up on that first question. So in terms of how we framed our proceeding relative to high DER, I think we've intended through this proceeding to really establish inputs and assumptions that can be vetted and a methodology that can inform other planning processes. But I think as for the details of how this might be taken up in high DER, that's obviously a question for that proceeding, and I don't want to speak to how those issues there will be resolved at this time, but certainly I think we can expect that the commission will be providing resolutions soon on addressing how this could potentially be used to inform pending loads, as well as I suppose scenario planning as well. But we definitely welcome questions about, interactions comments about how these may interact. And I think we have some questions, rolling questions targeted towards how stakeholders may see this informing those processes.
Yeah, thank you. I guess just a quick follow-up. Is the intention of this for it to be able to also cover some of the hotspots that may not align with corridors, or is that kind of being seen as something that will be covered through another process like pending loads or whatnot?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Alex. And I think, I just want to emphasize that we're not trying to solve for everything with this model. I think we're trying to establish inputs and assumptions and a methodology to inform, a slice of planning that we think may not be covered by some of the existing bottom-up sources, to the same extent. And I think that's been our intent with this effort, but we're certainly not intending or claiming that this covers every slice of load growth associated with TE. I think, this is a a specific and focused use case.
Okay,
Next,
thank you.
okay, great. Happy to, follow up more on this. Dean Taylor, we have a question from you in the chat. Or I'm sorry, you can answer your question or ask your question.
Yeah, it's really on the same topic. What I'm hearing is that you have your model could be modified to do what you might call private hotspots. Right now, correct me if I'm wrong, this is just doing public charging and what I would call shared behind the fence charging, where 2 or more fleets could use a key card or subscription to get in. But I think what a lot of us you're hearing from Alex at CalSTART, a lot of us are surprised about. We're thinking the hotspots are really elsewhere. They're like I said in my earlier question, on the factory and warehouse and seaport districts, where there's a lot of behind the fence fleets, as well as probably a lot of shared depots will be located in those areas. Assuming that the people don't want to, maybe they feel it's too risky to build it behind their fence, so they want to use a subscription model instead. So, I mean, the whole idea of hotspots is kind of a big deal, and it's kind of surprising me that you're not covering that. Or maybe can you cover it, I guess, is maybe a follow-up question.
Yes, certainly, this is something that could potentially be covered in a future iteration. But again, I think we've focused on one specific use case here. All right. Next, I'm going to provide Maria Cecilia with an opportunity to ask her question.
Hi, can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Sorry, I had some technical difficulties. Okay, hello, thank you. My name is Cecilia Pinto de Mora. I am a scientist at Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm Sam Houston's colleague. I have a more general question about the methodology. The CDN uses multiple sets of input data and an impressive number of assumptions. Methods exist to calibrate and validate large complex models with simpler models, which use a smaller number of inputs and can, for instance, like in integrated assessment climate models. This is one way to identify the data sets that might be responsible for more uncertainty in the methodology. Have you been able to test or validate the model on a simpler set of actual current data and compare the model results with real charging demands and load curves?
So we haven't yet actually tested we haven't tested it on actual data at this point in time. It's a methodology that we've designed and, we've vetted it internally. We have been looking at, some of the things short term and working with the CEC to help do that. But again, in terms of that near term forecasting actual load currently, it's one of the nuances behind this analysis or this methodology is looking at that long-term forecasting. So taking into account some features that may not necessarily allow it to align particularly well in the initial term with actual load, but giving a good perspective based on actual data for telematics data and aligned results with IPER data to make sure that it does provide good long-term forecasting for proactive planning. But it is certainly something that, as we're refining this methodology, and as we're thinking about this methodology, understanding how we can properly QC it against near-term on-the-ground truths.
Thank you.
I want to give Cole Cole an opportunity to ask a question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. This is Cole Germain with Environmental Defense Fund. I think my question is relevant both to the CDM and the inputs and assumptions. So I don't know if this is a better question for Gavin or for Will, but one of my concerns with the model that you've laid out is, it's using very short corridor segments, 3 miles or less. And it kind of assumes that charging is going to happen whenever the vehicles need to charge, but doesn't take into account the fact that vehicles will go to where there is charging, basically. And there's nothing in the model that I see right now that kind of takes into account where there is grid capacity or more easily can attain grid capacity for charging. So a driver may be happy to go 2 segments or 3 segments down the road if there is a large accessible charging site there that a utility could connect to the grid for cheaply versus staying where they are if there isn't grid capacity. So I'm just interested if you have any thoughts on kind of if there is a place in this model, either this iteration or a future iteration, to kind of account for the state of the grid or the accessibility of grid capacity and how that will influence where charging can actually be reasonably deployed.
Yeah, that's certainly something that we've talked about. We really want to emphasize that nuance about looking at proactive future charging and or proactive planning and looking at future charging down the road. And that's, to your point about why we are focusing on, kind of saying any corridor segment and not really saying like, that load would be assigned to specific segments or allocated to certain segments based on other factors outside of the likelihood of charging based on state of charge. But we do integrate into existing infrastructure, and we have discussed how we could look at bringing in those features to kind of better inform where charging might happen. It would certainly impact like the continuous SU. It would start to move it into a direction of more discrete charging and trying to accommodate areas where it has to blend the two, where there might be charging needed in areas that don't have a lot of infrastructure to have that like load assigned to, whereas there might be areas that do have infrastructure. But I think the short answer to your question is we are considering these things, and we're looking to, as mentioned, integrate existing infrastructure and truck stops as well as ways to kind of identify where infrastructure might be. I think grid needs is something that we could look into. We haven't talked about as extensively, but we are looking at ways to, in future iterations, think about what is actually on the ground and how that would drive charging, as opposed to this more continuous approach, this likelihood approach.
Got it. Thank you.
We can take a question from Jason at Terawatt.
Hi, yes, thanks. I guess I would like to reiterate some of the comments from CalSTAR as well, saying there's definitely there may be some overlap on how we're designating what is corridor versus what we as an industry and developers are looking at as logistics, where we're developing primarily. We believe logistics areas will be developed first. Those may be adjacent to a corridor, so there might be some overlap there, but certainly, the drayage industry is going to be electrified first versus corridor from a total cost of operations perspective from the industry at large. So just, keeping that in context, I know there's a need also to go model, what we call kind of more of this corridor long haul transportation, where you're needing areas where people are charging, topping off from their base area. I guess looking at your maps, you're going at the 2045. My question here is, what technology assumptions are you making over time? And based on the location, are you assuming different technology considerations, both from a charger level and the capability of the charge curves of the vehicles? And these are vehicles like, industry's rapidly changing, and we're going to see voltage architectures increase for MCS. And we're not planning on building a single, charging like corridor charging depot without MCS on it, moving forward. So are you assuming the industry's flipping and moving to MCS, or what are you thinking on these corridors? especially when you get out past 2030.
So, Will, maybe you can speak a bit more towards like the technological assumptions that we have in the INA, but in terms of, again, like the modeling itself, we are trying to avoid being prescriptive about, you know, the technology that can accommodate the charging in those long-term years. We appreciate that it's a very, very fast evolving space, and that, you know, not just whether or not a port will be at this location to accommodate this load, but also what will that port look like? Will the technology associated with that be? How will the vehicles be able to accommodate, like charge off those things, off those ports? All those very nuanced and hard to pin down answers right now, looking so far in the future. We address them, or attempt to address them, through that likelihood approach, where we're not really assuming that charging infrastructure will be here, charging infrastructure of a certain type. We're identifying the demand needed at that corridor segment and, you know, adjacent corridor segments. So whatever technology is there to accommodate that demand, that's something we're not, this methodology isn't necessarily aiming to define at this time. We are simply saying that, you know, in the future, based on what we understand about traffic behavior, how many vehicles are going to be electrified, what are some assumptions about state of charge, how far they're traveling, efficiency assumptions, total amounts of energy, this location will likely have a large amount of demand, and not really, and this is the tech, and we're not carrying that conversation to, and this is the technology that meets this demand.
I guess
But
I'm not so hung up on the technology, but that drives demand and energy consumption. And so how, like, assuming a 350 charger scenario into the future versus a 1 megawatt is significant. And so how are you assuming that, right? That's what I'm getting at. And but that's driven by the technology. So you in some cases you have to assume a certain technology transition that's going to, you know, if you've got 1,000 vehicles on a segment per day, and you're assuming they're charging at 350 versus 750 or a 1,000 kW charger over the next 20 years, you're going to be order of magnitudes off. So I'm just trying to understand how you're contemplating that change in technology, or change, let's just say change in demand then.
yeah, we are accounting for the evolution of technology, and I'll let Will speak to that in a bit more detail as they are derived from the inputs and assumptions.
Yep. So we assume that charger power gradually increases. You know, MCS is a thing that's coming on. I would say right now, even public and shared charging, a lot of it doesn't have MCS. You're looking at 350, 400 kilowatt chargers. So we assume that, especially for public and shared charging in the future, it will move towards MCS charging. And that's an expectation that happens over time. We have kind of what's the near range charger power and what's the longer range charger power. The assumption is it's kind of a linear increase over time.
Great, thanks. I appreciate you clarifying that.
Yep.
So I would like to note we're coming up on our question period for the CDM, but however, we're rolling into our general question period. So we'll continue to take questions in the chat, or I'm sorry, from raised hands and in the chat as well. However, I do want to also invite folks, if people have more general questions about some of the topics we're inquiring about with the ruling questions, feel free to raise your hand or ask questions in the chat relating to that as well. Let's see. We can take a question from David Castle at this time.
Hey, thanks. I have a couple. I have a couple related questions about that flow chart. Maybe we could go back to that slide. My particular question is about the load shape here. So if I'm reading this right, the actual energy would be driven by those other boxes. Is the load shape that's indicated here, is that just like a percent allocation of load across a 24-hour period or something like that? Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, we're taking normalized load shapes and applying it to an average daily energy need at a corridor segment to establish, you know, when during the day a vehicle would be charging and how much energy would be needed at those specific hours.
And the average energy need, that's from all the other inputs and calculations that are shown here?
Yeah.
So
we
okay,
calculate, go ahead.
Yeah, so then my question about that load shape is in the inputs document, it notes that level 1, level 2, and fast charging are consolidated into a single load shape. And it seems like for this, we'd really need to break out load shapes that are differentiated between level 2 and fast charging, since level 2 presumably be a lot more overnight, whereas fast charging would be more spread out the day. Can you talk a little bit about L2 load shapes versus fast charging load shapes?
Will, is this something you want to take? Discuss a little more about the load shapes themselves that are in the INA?
Yeah. So we have, I'm trying to see where, right. So I think there's the difference between kind of what trying to align with IPER and figure out places to depart from IPER. I think that you're exactly right that load shapes will differ based off of charging technology and based off of vehicle type. And so one of the things that for this particular exercise, DCFC is much more important because we're not anticipating a lot of medium and heavy duty vehicles using L2 public charging. Just not really a use case we're expecting. We're expecting that some medium duty will use L2 charging, but at depots, not necessarily at public charging. So the DCFC is really the one that we're keying in on. But I think you're exactly right that the load shapes will look different based off the vehicle type and the charger type.
So do you have, I guess, how did you get the MDHD fast charging load shape? I'm just curious where that comes from, because it sounds like it's not actually from the IPER, if the IPER is providing a consolidated load shape across charging types.
Yeah, and so I think that one of the exercises that we are doing right now is trying to gather all of the load shapes that are out there coming from different sources. And so that's a little bit outside of this TEP analysis, but a separate work stream. And so I think looking at telemetry data from particular pilot projects, looking at pilot projects that have been pushed by CPUC, looking at other projects from the IOUs. And so there are a series of different load shapes that we're looking at and trying to evaluate what type of charging power do they use. Is it for buses? Is it for heavy duty vehicles? Is it for medium duty vehicles? What do they look like? And so we have all these different load shapes and we have to figure out which one to use. And so I think that is an exercise that we are talking with CEC about right now, and also the folks at LBNL. And it's a very collaborative kind of situation trying to figure out what those load shapes are, because it's important and it's also hard because there's not a lot of that data out there. We're trying to get as much of that data as we can.
So that to say that the load shape box on this is still a work in progress then?
Very much so. And so I think that you got to put a stake in the sand somewhere. And so that's kind of taking the best available information we had a year ago whenever we did this. And I think the space is moving so fast that I think those load shapes will definitely be something that we update in the next iteration.
So that makes sense. And I guess sort of following up the previous question about 350 versus megawatt scale charging, it seems like that load shape box is perhaps one of the big areas where transitioning from 350 to megawatt scale that could see big changes in that load shape. Are there other pieces of this that you think would be sort of in most need of further updating or another look based on that transition from 350 to megawatt scale? I'm trying to think about how we talked about how it's a flexible framework. It's designed to evolve. Where are the points where you want to put a magnifying glass on if that were a particular concern?
Right now, based off the interviews I had, that would be best. So I think a lot of depots, a lot of public and shared charging are using batteries. And so one of those batteries charging. And that's important. That's different than when vehicles are charging from the grid. And right now, that is a very important part. And it's something that we are thinking about for future iterations, but it's not something that's in there. But I think that that's a very interesting area. And to your point, the trying to have different load shapes associated with different charging power is challenging and figuring out how to incorporate that.
Great, thanks.
Okay, next I'd like to take a question from Sam.
Great. Thanks so much. Yes, Sam Houston from Union of Concerned Science again. I'm really appreciating this discussion. A few thoughts and questions, things here. One, just picking up on what Alex and Dean and Jason have said about corridors and what's near corridors. I'm wondering, is it possible for stakeholders to get access to sort of the map of these corridors, like Figure 2.3 in the CDM? Because I think if we could look a little more closely at where some of the corridors and collector roads are, we get a little better idea. If we could zoom in on, I don't know, Port of Long Beach, Port of Oakland or something, some of the key logistics areas might help alleviate some concerns, and then, emphasize other areas that, if they can't be included in this, need to be treated somehow. So that's just one kind of thought and question, which is the ability for folks, can we have the ability for folks to dig in on like what's actually covered here along the corridors and within 1 mile? That may be something just to take back. I don't know if we need an answer here on that in the moment, if it's possible to share.
Sam, I do want to highlight, we've provided at a very high level some of the visuals associated with our run of the model using the 2023 IPER inputs, but certainly hear where you're coming from with that request.
Yeah, and those were definitely helpful. Yeah, I think it's just like maybe being able to check some of the hot spots that folks are expecting to see. Oh, maybe this warehouse actually is within 1 mile of a collector road, and I think that'd be really helpful to understand. So if there's possibility to dig on in some more dynamically, I think I just put a plug in for that being super helpful. Another thought I had, just hearing Cole, and where is grid capacity? I don't know that I saw anything about load hosting in one of the layers. The various input layers we have includes things like, ambient air quality, includes things like IOU service area. Recognizing there are some limitations even with those, but just want to note that having a layer like that might also be pretty informative to be able to look at with the results. And then my other main question actually is I saw the slide with the outputs of the model, which I think are super helpful and interesting to look at, to see some of those, some of the interstitial corridors and how important those are going to be. Looking at that and then checking the visualizations that you just mentioned, Emily, I'm seeing it reported an average daily peak, and so I think from what I've heard in terms of the data and the process here, being able to see peak loads, peak load hotspots in those locations might also be possible, but I just wanted to test that and see if that is an output that would also be available.
Sam, with respect to the previous question, I'll let Guidehouse take the question on average versus peak. I'm sorry, can you just remind the second question?
Yeah, I mentioned, seeing that some of the load hosting capacity.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Might be
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I think we've kind of outlined in the CDM methodology, and I think it's somewhat buried in there, but we certainly see an opportunity to work with the IOUs to incorporate their knowledge of the system, their electrical systems, with what we've developed here. And I think, we thought about certainly trying to use, or to incorporate those layers, but I think we felt ultimately that we didn't have the level of detail and information to really accurately characterize the capacity. And so ultimately, I think we see an interaction between this product or the TEP outputs and the IOUs, before this could be used to inform planning. But I'll let Guidehouse take the question around peak.
Yeah, so just as a bit of clarification, you're saying you see that like there's average daily peak, but you're looking for overall peak. Is that like an annual peak as opposed to like a daily peak, like for within that within the EV segment? Or are you saying like connecting that with system peak, which would be incorporate things outside of EVs? I just want to make sure I understand what you mean by when you say peak as opposed to average daily peak.
Yeah, I guess thanks for that, the follow-up there. I guess I am trying to, in the spirit of imagining ways that this can be connected to other efforts. I'm not sure what the average daily peak gets us, and so I don't know if it's going all the way to full system peak, or if there's like a, just having the absolute peak for that location be better, probably would be the thing that would be better to understand. And then, to Emily's point about working with the, IOUs on this, understand how that links to the distribution constraints and whatnot. But yeah, I'm not seeing how to go from average daily peak to like something really pointed about planning. And it just seems like, the average annual peak, or the average, the annual peak would be something that would be, more appropriate to plan to over time.
Yeah, so I think that the way the model works, and we do provide, an annual overall amount of energy that's being allocated to a corridor segment. So we do look at that on an annual basis. We have to, because of the nature of the origin destination data, we aren't necessarily given a lot of perspective into the variations in traffic that would be able to distinguish one day from another. So we're not, like weekends and weekdays, we're able to get into that level of granularity, but like, January 3rd versus March 8th versus August 16th, we're not really like receiving data at a level that we can say this has different energy than that day, outside of your typical expectations around changes in efficiency. So we've talked about, seasonal variation in efficiency and things like that. But so that's why we position it as an average day, and as like the kilowatt hours. So the total energy, that's that first piece. And then getting to the peak for that average day, again, we discussed this a little earlier, but that's just like an application of a normalized load profile to get that distribution of that 24 hours worth of energy to each of those hours. And so that, like, because of the load profiles, again, we have, some of them are not, varying too aggressively on like every single day. They are closer to like, built out as like 8760s, but they're closer to like very like, 24-hour load profiles. So that's why we position as average daily peak, and it could be perceived as like, the annual peak, because it would be the peak hour for the day, but for the year, if each day is pretty much the same in amount of energy usage. Again, don't have a lot of perspective at this time into having that, like, what is the difference between August 15th and August 18th, as well as those load profiles. As always, we've talked about this. It's a methodology. It's intended for refinement. So we'd definitely like to look into capturing more nuance in both load profiles as well as that origin, like the underlying data to give. Right now, we operate within the constraints of the data we have, and that gives us that annual day. So I think, to answer your question, it could be perceived as the annual peak, that the peak hour of the average day, but are looking into, or we'd like to continue to look into ways to refine that to more closely represent variations in days, both from a load profile as well as actual daily energy usage by traffic.
Okay, so we'll take questions till about 11:55. So just in the order I'm seeing hands raised, we'll take a question from Saeed, Alex, Jason, and then David last.
Thank you very much. This is Said Manshadi representing UCAN. I appreciate the presentation and the methodology, Gavin. I have a question regarding the way that you're assuming electrification. There are numerous studies that indicates electrification would change the behavior of driving, ODPers, even the user equilibrium to model the traffic. So reading the CDM, I feel like you considered all of this methodology based on the assumption that we have ICE vehicles. I didn't see any approach or any bridge to consider the electrification impact, because electrification itself would make a difference here. So do you have any pathway to reconsider the model to capture electrification impact on the methodology and how the output results are going to be there?
So are you saying that essentially through electrification, driving behavior could, like, somebody goes from A to B less often, or they travel a different route? Is that how you're saying, like, electrification could theoretically impact?
That could be one aspect. Other aspect is just how fast they drive, how much energy they use. Even if you're considering freight operators, they might consider energy as a huge cost. They could reconsider even their own planning. So my point is, many of these. So basically, the entire assumption, the telemetric data, all of the inputs that you have are based on ICE vehicles. I don't see any approach that you did map that in how electrified, freights would be different in this way.
Yeah. So this is another thing that, like, Will could definitely answer, but we do a lot of other assumptions outside of the origin destination. Those are tied to electric vehicles, things like efficiency and how that evolves over time, vehicle miles traveled and how that evolves over time. We are looking at that at the powertrain level. So it's not exclusively associated with ICE. Where your point is absolutely valid is in that telematics data and, like, the origin, destination, and route analysis, where the data that we had, we weren't able to get that perspective on powertrain, and so we had to apply a methodology to essentially break out the powertrain, and we weren't able to, using that data, modify it in any way that would reflect like a change because of vehicle electrification. And that's what I was kind of referring to when I first asked your, like, clarification, is like, we have a vehicle that travels from A to B X frequently, or trips that occur at X frequency that travel these specific routes at Y frequency. We assume that remains static over time. And again, as more data becomes available, we're able to iterate on this methodology. We're able to integrate that. So that'd be something we'd love to look into as if the data becomes available. But as the model currently exists, that piece we didn't really modify in terms of considering how EVs might impact it. But there are a large number of assumptions that are specific to vehicle electrification, and look at how electric vehicles evolve over time. And Will was talking about the technology associated with chargers, but like I said, efficiency evolves over time. I think VMT might be evolving over time.
I'm mainly worried about the traffic models, like how the behavior is going to change. I understand that you did consider in terms of power calculation, definitely that it's the power trains, but not the other side. Kind of a follow-up, if I may, quickly on that. And the, like, ICE assumption I see that made into EVs here. And that's about the potential for load management at each charging station. Possibly, we might be able to, you don't have to provide the overall capacity all the time. Sometimes you could have a reduced rate of charge to avoid like such huge peaks. So some recommendations, some ways to understand if some sort of advanced load management could help with basically shaving the peak at the charging station location. I'm talking about reducing the rate if needed to avoid having a gigantic sudden charge impact on the street. I didn't see that consideration happening in this CDM model. Do you have any pathway to consider and basically integrate potential ALMs at charging locations with this methodology?
Saeed, that's not included in the current iteration of this model, but we do ask a ruling question related to that, and certainly would welcome any comments on that. Just in the interest of time, I do want to provide others with the opportunity to ask questions. So we'll go to Alex, Jason, and David. And if we can just keep these questions brief, as we have about 10 minutes here.
Yeah, I guess we've sort of been talking about this to some degree. I guess it's kind of a question and a comment, which is how frequently you plan to update this tool and whether you plan to refresh the assumptions now, before publishing. I guess I understand that this is a really rapidly moving sector, but my impression from reviewing the inputs right now is that much of them are still kind of reflecting a regulatory compliance world when things have really or evolved into a market-driven opportunity world where there's just going to be a lot more shared charging, a lot more reliance on direct current fast charging and megawatt charging that's being future-proofed today, where utilization is going to need to be higher, vehicle miles traveled are going to need to be higher to make TCO pencil out. So yeah, I guess just kind of commenting on that impression and wondering, if this is going to be refreshed now and pretty frequently.
Yeah, so I can follow up on that piece. So I think in terms of I would break this into, I think we have some short-term immediate updates that are planned. So as soon as 2025 IPER numbers are available, we plan to update this and rerun our model outputs. And I think we can anticipate that the 2025 IPER will have some shifts, reflecting the current policy and regulatory environment. So I think that's kind of a short-term immediate change. Certainly, we are, again, looking for through the ruling questions, for parties to comment about how they see these inputs and assumptions impacted by, the current environment. So, we're definitely open to making those changes depending on what we hear from stakeholders. And as in terms of the cadence going forward, I think that's again just something we're looking for comment on. Given the relatively rapid shifts in the space, what timeline seems reasonable to make these updates. Again, if this were to be informing other planning processes. So thanks for that question. We'll move now to Jason.
Hey, yes, thanks. I guess probably a little sort of similar lines. If we're only evaluating these corridors, are we taking into consideration other demand impacts from EV electrification outside of that scope, and how those may even impact, the grid area around there? Like, so if you're only planning with, these defined areas, and this is influencing where we're investing in infrastructure, where is the analysis of what is the impact just adjacent to it, where it's also impacting the same infrastructure? So what we see a lot as, like, use the Inland Empire, for example, regardless of whether a site is next to a corridor or 2 miles from there in a logistics area, they could potentially all be impacting the same substation. And so we're seeing that type of systematic impact. And if we're not looking at that, where we're going to see majority of the growth in the logistics areas, which may or may not be included in this, we're only getting part of the picture. So just wondering how you might consider that, going forward.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, our proceeding again is somewhat more narrowly focused. And so I think that's maybe a question for some of the frameworks being established in high DER. So again, I don't think that's a question, adjacent loads, especially from other sources, are not what we're necessarily looking to tackle through this. But certainly important for the overall planning process. Moving to David.
Thanks. I have one quick clarification and one more complicated question. So the quick clarification is for the visualizations that you provided. So is that based on the consolidated load shape, you know, L1, L2, DC, FC as all one load shape used together? Is that correct?
I believe so. Will, you can give perspective on, you know, what are the load shapes, but yeah, I believe like that's the case. Will, am I correct in saying that?
That's right. I think
Yeah.
the important context there is that almost all of the load that we're expecting from medium and heavy duty vehicles at public charging is DCFC. So
Yeah.
I think like they are consolidated, but for purposes, just think of them as DCFC.
Okay. And then the second question goes back to the daily peak versus annual peak. I totally get that we're not trying to predict August 16th versus 18th, but it does seem like we should be accounting for seasonal variation. We know that light duty happens a lot more in the summertime. I don't know if on medium duty and heavy duty it follows a similar peak or is driven by other things. Like, I don't know if like this holiday shopping season drives up traffic or anything for long haul, but it seems like that would be relatively straightforward to add in. I would assume there's like lots of data showing broad industry trends about like monthly allocation of energy. And it would seem like that'd be pretty significant on the results, you know, to have like a, you know, peak month daily shape compared to a off-peak month daily shape. Both would be pretty different than the average, I would think. So just wondering if you agree with my assumption there, and if you have thoughts on integrating sort of a seasonal or monthly look into this.
So efficiency, we do vary efficiency on seasonality. So that is something captured in here. You know, with the average daily, we can certainly look into, you know, implementing that and having it more explicitly called out for like the month. But it is something that we are capturing, and we're trying to represent that value as closest to, like, you know, appreciating that efficiency as we can. So it is kind of a generalized value. I think that we can certainly look into ways of implementing much more granular at like the month level. But yeah, we do have things that look at the efficiency as it varies over the season.
Yeah, I guess to put it more clearly, for planning, we don't need the average daily peak. We need the peak peak, right? And so, you know, for light duty, maybe you can approximate that by saying, here's the average for August or something, if we can't get the actual, like an actual peak day. But that's, as we think about using this for planning, I think, as was stated by someone else earlier, that's definitely like a very, something that we're thinking about a lot.
Thanks for those comments. I think for our last question, we have time for one more from Wasim. If you'd like to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering, how are the vehicles identified mapped to the corridors? Because I understand that you have a vehicle list from the same data set that the IPER uses. So are you mapping those vehicles directly, or are you doing some kind of averaging to just approximate how many vehicles will reach each corridor?
So the underlying telematics data, the origin destination data that we receive, and the route analysis data associated with this has that sort of granular breakdown of vehicle types that we are then able to crosswalk to IPER vehicle classes. So that's how we're saying that, like, you know, a personally owned, a PVC, personal vehicle, light duty vehicle is on this corridor versus like a long haul truck or a vocational truck. We have that perspective into the origin destination data. And then, like I said, that can be mapped over to the IPER.
Okay, so is it just the telematics data that's being used there? Because I did see there was also RigDig data and FAF5 data, I believe it was called, that's also being referenced. Is that not being used or mapping vehicle types?
So FAF5 data is used to inform the underlying road network. So that's kind of where we're starting in terms of defining what are the corridors. We mentioned, you know, arterials, collectors, things of that nature, as well as that initial split of like variation in traffic. That's what we use FAF5 for. Will, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like RigDig is used to some extent for depot data. Maybe you can speak better on the RigDig.
Yeah, so I think two important things. We have information about where vehicles are located, where they're domiciled, and that's at the census tract level. And so then we use the trip information to say like, all right, here are the vehicles, and then where are they driving? And then that's how we're able to map them to corridors.
Mm-hmm. And that trip information is from telematics data, is that correct?
Geotab, yeah.
Okay. And then, okay, that answers all my questions. Thank you.
So certainly want to, if folks have additional questions after this webinar, certainly would invite you to reach out. If we can just move several slides ahead, I'd just like to talk through wrap up and next steps. So we've extended the rolling comment period. So opening comments will be due on 11/14/25 and reply comments will be due on 12-5. And I just want to note as well that we've issued some corrections just regarding the way certain of our documents were referenced in the original in the original set of ruling questions. So certainly invite folks to check out the docket if you didn't see those updates and clarifications. But certainly please feel free to reach out to me or to Emmanuel Truex, our supervisor, if you have any questions prior to that time or remaining items that were not able to be clarified today on the call. And we'll be posting materials from today's workshop on our CPUC TEP website. So at this time, I just want to thank everyone for your great questions and engagement throughout today's webinar. I think it's been really helpful to hear your feedback, and we look forward to reading your comments soon. I don't know if there's anything else to say from the Guidehouse team, but if not, we can wrap up. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And yes, looking forward to hearing more from you all soon. Take care.